as folks have been walking in. So I want to confirm that.
Yes.
Are we good on roll call? Or do you need to confirm anyone online?
No, we're good on roll call, and online we have Helen Singleton, Johanna Greenspan Johnson speaking, Scott Whitehurst, and Whitney Catchmark.
Okay.
And there's one other person, let me bring them in. It's appropriate. Emma Corbett is online guest.
Excellent. Okay. Excellent. So our first order of business, and we'll try to keep this according to our agenda here, is the adoption of our current agenda that you all can see. Someone could just make a motion to adopt the current agenda. We'll just vote on it.
So moved.
Thank you so much. So we do have a motion to adopt the current agenda as you see displayed on the screen. It's shown hopefully online. All in favor of adopting the current agenda, say
Aye.
any opposed? Okay. There you go. The ayes have it. The agenda is so adopted. The next order of business is the adoption of the 2023 quarter 4 meeting minutes, which you guys should have received previously. Should have had some time to review it. Hopefully you have. So can someone make a motion to adopt the quarter 4 2023 meeting minutes? We'll take a look on that. Okay, thank you. So we do have a motion to adopt the quarter 4 2023 meeting minutes. Let's just take a vote. All in favor of adopting that quarter 4 2023 meeting minutes, say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Any opposed, say nay. Thank you. That's been adopted as well. We can just sort of keep things moving on with our overview. So I will hand this over to Carolyn. Thank you.
Wheeler, are we okay on audio?
I believe so, waiting for them to confirm.
Okay, well, hopefully you all online can hear us. Scott, Whitney, Kellen,
Hey, Chris Watson as well.
I'll give a thumbs up, so I think we're good. And of course, you all feel free to come off mute at any point if you would like to make a comment. We should be able to hear you here in group, so. All right, we'll start out just like normally with kind of a quick overview of the subcommittee, what the subcommittee is working on, and the TAC in general, and then I'm going to talk about some updates from our side on things we've been talking about previously with the end user survey and the impact assessment. We're going to have an update from Johanna and the Dewberry team about that impact assessment approach. And then we'll get into talking a little bit about the projects and initiatives, looking ahead to discussing that for the next meeting. So let's get into it. So just as a reminder, we're here to talk about Coastal Resilience Master Plan Phase 2. As you all know, here is an outline of what that plan is. We highlighted under the elements in bold are the flood hazard impact assessment, the plan for resilience actions, and the TAC subcommittee recommendations. These are the things that this subcommittee is primarily charged with supporting us to create for this plan and update. So this plan is due in December of this year, and we'll be meeting quarterly in the subcommittee and the full TAC until then. The objectives of the subcommittee are, again, to inform and support the impact assessments. We have been talking about that in the past several meetings, and we'll continue talking about it today. And then to inform and support the identification of planned resilience actions, again, those projects and initiatives that we are collecting as we build our inventory for the coastal region. And then lastly, to help us develop recommendations for future planning. So our schedule, the past 2 meetings, as I said, we've been talking about the impact assessment. Today we'll be doing kind of an update and holistic overview of the approach to that from Dewberry, and then starting to talk about planned resilience actions, looking ahead to the remainder of our meetings to the end of this year. We'll be continuing to talk about planned resilience actions and that projects and initiatives inventory, and then focusing, starting at our next meeting, on recommendations for future plans. A couple of general updates from DCR Office for Resilience Planning. So we have signed our, we have a contract in place with Dewberry for all of their work under this phase 2 plan that you see on the left-hand side of the screen here. So they are actively working on our flood hazard data. We'll be talking about the impact assessment today, and then they'll also be supporting us with, the Web Explorer update mockup, and they've already provided a summary of the end user survey results that we'll go through today as well. So all of that work is currently in progress. As we've been mentioning in the past couple of meetings, we're hiring a consultant under an umbrella style contract to support with additional work under this, this plan. So that includes the bullets you see on the right side of the screen, projects and initiatives analysis, looking at some financial and funding tools and information. That's primarily the funding subcommittee supporting that, conducting and supporting outreach and engagement work, developing the final report, and then updating that Web Explorer. So we're in the process of supporting, selecting a consultant. I think I might have disconnected from the Zoom. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay,
No, it just stopped sharing.
I think I might do that.
Okay, we're getting that sound is tinny. So, see if we can figure out what's going on.
Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Sorry about that. Okay, so that's kind of a high level overview of where we're at with this work. I'm gonna go over some old business now, talk about the end user survey, and then we'll get into that presentation from Dewberry on impact assessment. So for the end user survey, as you all know, this came out of a recommendation from multiple of our TAC subcommittees to try to understand how folks use the phase one planning products and how kind of what funding and financial barriers they had encountered as doing flood resilience work. So we did launch the survey. It was open from December to January. We got 49 responses, 41 of which were from our desired end users. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Some of the high level takeaways from the survey, most people that answered did think that the phase one products are useful. The most useful thing was the Web Explorer, and the least useful is the open data downloads. We did find that the products have been previously utilized for a variety of use cases. I'll talk more about those use cases in a minute. And across the board, more people said that they would use those products for use cases in the future than have said that they've used the products previously. So the question was open to how to use it previously, or could you use it in the future? And then lastly, respondents did see clear opportunities for the Commonwealth to support efforts to address flood resilience. So who actually responded? The graph at the top here shows the breakdown of our respondents. We got 6 state agencies responding, including DEQ, DCR, DHCD, DDEM, DDOT, and the Port Authority. We had all 8 coastal PDCs submit a response. We had 18 local governments responding. And there was at least 1 local government responded from every PDC except for Greater. And we also had 1 tribal government respond to the survey. In terms of what products have been used, as I mentioned before, the Coastal Resilience Web Explorer was the most used product. But I guess importantly, more than 30% of our respondents said they have not used the product previously in their work. And several responses pointed out kind of the data being too specific to coastal flood hazards for their needs. So maybe they needed more different types of flood hazard data, which, as you all know, we're addressing in phase 2. We also had fewer than 40% of respondents say they use the open data. So as I mentioned, that is the least used product of the ones that we did produce in phase 1. So the Coastal Resilience Web Explorer, this is looking specifically at that tool. It was overwhelmingly seen as useful. Again, this is the most used product from phase 1. Within that, the hazards information was seen as the most useful. Highlighting here for our subcommittee, the impacts and the projects and initiatives tab. So impacts were seen as kind of the second most useful, but the comment was that there needs to be more visibility into the data, which is driving those results, which we expected based on conversations with you all and conversations with others in the past. On the projects and initiative side, this was among the least used product. what seemed clear to me from looking at the responses was that people would like to be able to share knowledge about ongoing projects and initiatives across the region. But they don't really think that our plan and the products we're developing right now or have developed in phase one met that need. So for example, somebody said it's very valuable to understand what's happening across the state, especially in communities like ours, small and highly urban. So that, we know that knowledge sharing is helpful. In terms of the different use cases that I mentioned, so these on the left-hand side, you can see the list of use cases that we asked about. We also had kind of an open-ended question about additional use cases. So I've underlined the most popular use cases for these products in terms of what has been used previously and what people say they'll use in the future. The top 5 most popular have used previously answers do somewhat align with our 2021 survey that we put out before the phase 1 plan actually came out, where people were looking to the plan to help them prioritize and fund projects, build awareness and motivate action, coordinate leadership to implement a state plan of action, develop a needs assessment and data to use in resilience efforts, and then provide guidance for appropriate adaptation options. And then on the right-hand side of the screen here, you can see, to help answer the question, which we've heard before, how does the state plan to use this plan or has used the plan? You can see here a few bullets about the ways in which state agencies responded about how they have used the Coastal Resilience Master Plan Phase 1. So public education awareness, program and operational decisions, and research were the most common responses. I do have some examples of that. You all should have received a copy of the end user survey in the handouts PDF that was distributed. I also have some printout copies here in the room, so you can review the full responses. There are some details about how state governments responded to that question, such as how natural heritage and DCR uses the data and so forth. In general, few people said that the products are insufficient to use for these use cases, suggesting that the way that the products were developed weren't inherently a source of major limitations. But could use but do not intend to use did receive a good chunk of the responses. We didn't get a lot of clarity on why folks don't intend to use the products if they could use them. And in that category, capital investment decisions received the most votes. So what are the takeaways for us in the subcommittee? I tried to pull out some bullets from the survey results for both the impact assessment and the planned resilience action analysis to help us inform the subcommittee's work and our work in these areas of the plan. So under impact assessment, we know that one of the most popular responses was that we needed to include impacts from all forms of flooding and not just coastal flooding. Of course, we are doing that with phase 2. We also heard that we should be communicating more of the impacts in dollar terms. Again, Joanna will talk about this more in her slides, but we are trying to do that where we can. Include information about flood insurance coverage and gaps, and improve access to data behind the kind of impacts assessment via the Web Explorer and open data downloads are 2 things that I think we can consider moving ahead in this work. And then planned resilience actions. I think there's some great feedback here on how to make that knowledge sharing, that inventory more helpful, specifically highlighting examples of how the plan has been used. So we have some of that information now from the end user survey, so we can do some of that. But there were also a lot of comments about how to better integrate and align this plan with other planning efforts, particularly at the state level. So with the hazard mitigation plan, and then including kind of about how those different plans are coordinated together. So I won't read through all of these bullets, but I think there are some good takeaways for us to think through and consider. Please do, if you have some time, take a look through that full survey summary that was sent out in handouts. Okay, are there any questions or comments on the end user survey before we get into the impact assessment?
Any questions online?
No, we're still working on the sound. So no questions.
Okay. All right. Well, I do want to say again, thank you for everybody who took the time to respond to the survey. I know a lot of people in this room did respond, so we appreciate your feedback. It's helpful to have it in writing and to use. We'll be continuing to use it from TCR's side in informing the plan products and working with Tuberry. Hopefully it works to present. So quickly, just an overview of the impact assessment process before I turn it over to Johanna. So how this is going to work, we're currently in this first phase of the asset impact assessment process. So we're currently working, what Dewberry is working on is putting together kind of a list of our assets, looking back at our phase one asset data, making updates where new data is available, collecting new data sets that we're adding to that, and then documenting decisions about which data we're using in this process. The other kind of concurrent thing that's happening is the methodology review. So similarly, looking back at our methodology for the impact assessment from phase one, including in that kind of some of the impact input we've received from stakeholders about our updated approach, and looking at how we're going to calculate, organize, and summarize the results from this assessment. So this includes figuring out with phase two how to summarize impacts for multiple flood hazard sources. So we're not just looking at coastal flooding now, we're also looking at multiple sources of flooding. So that's going on now. We'll be working on that. Dewberry will be working on that through April. And then starting in March and continuing through July, what we'll be doing is the impact assessment and data summaries. So actually carrying out that methodology that we've developed, calculating the impacts and producing the data. That is all contingent upon receiving the flood hazard data inputs, which are going to be completed on time in April. So that's the first side of this work, to do kind of the quantitative impact assessment and develop those outputs. The next step, then moving into July and September, is to incorporate that as well as some of our more qualitative data and input from stakeholders, and also our kind of some separate contextual data analysis that we'll be doing to build, kind of look at what are our stories, what are the key takeaways that we want to draw from, to incorporate in the plan in terms of what is the most important decision, the important information that decision makers need to know to take action on flood risk. So that process will be starting kind of in the summer, and then at the same time and kind of concurrently through the end of the planning process, we'll be kind of building out the final product in its design and its delivery. So the plan itself, but also the Web Explorer and potentially other products to help communicate, again, the most important takeaways for decision makers to know about flood risk and resilience in the coastal region. Okay, so what we're talking about today is really that first step in the process, the asset list review and the methodology review. That's what Johanna will be presenting on, working on identifying at the asset level what data we want to analyze. We've already gotten some input from you all on looking ahead to these later steps, and we'll have more opportunities for that later in the process. Potentially via email. We have a lot to cover in this subcommittee, so we don't want to, we have to be careful about how we use our meeting time. So we'll certainly be sending out things, if not in this meeting itself in the future, electronically, opportunities for you all to provide input on how those products are packaged and delivered in the final plan. But all that said, for today, we really want to focus on that first step. So what is the input, the key input data and the methodology for doing that base quantitative analysis to have kind of the suite of data to draw from in the plan? All right, so Johanna, I am going to turn it over to you to present. It looks like she is frozen on my screen. Hopefully
She's moving in here,
Okay.
but she's muted.
Johanna, can she hear us? It's like our message.
I don't know.
Thank you. Okay, I had to be unmuted. Or had some issue. All right. So can everyone hear me all right? Just
Yeah.
thumbs up. Okay, perfect. All right. Thanks everyone. And thanks Carolyn for the overview and the intro. So we'll present medium level, not the highest level, but try to get a little bit in the weeds, but not too much on some of the changes that we're looking to make from phase 1 to phase 2. I know some people on this panel were part of the phase 2 process and kind of provided input into the data and the processes at that point in time. Also know it's been a few years maybe since you've thought about that in detail. So we'll be going over kind of some of the general processes as well to try to bring everyone up to the same place. The goal of updating this impact assessment is really looking to revisit the data and methods we used in phase 1, not do a complete overhaul, start from scratch, but revisit them and see where there's room for improvement. Looking to expand flood hazard types. We'll get into that. So not just coastal flooding, but also looking at rainfall driven, alluvial, and as well as riverine flooding. Expand the set of impact indicators. So what we're using to measure impacts, we'll get into that. Continuing to look at improving data quality that comes with additional data sources, updating more recent data sources, and hopefully moving towards being able to develop and deliver and share more different types of data products. Okay. Next slide. Not sure. Okay, thank you. So again, key updates on the data side is we're probably doing some level of restructuring of asset data types, including new hazard information and having an expanded quality control process. On the methodology side, we're looking at how to do impacts for different types of hazards and asset types, expanding some of the understanding of vulnerability and risk for certain types of assets. And then we'll also be summarizing across different types of geographies, including potentially using HUCs. That's something we'll revisit in a later stage of this process when we get more to that kind of presentation, summary development, pulling out the threads and stories there. Next slide. Next. All right. So we're really using a lot of the same stuff we did last time, but we are expanding a little bit. So our key categories we're looking at community resources. So that's asset-based information that relates to people, population, residential structures, kind of stuff, as well as built infrastructure, and we're kind of splitting up built infrastructure like our roads and energy systems and water systems with more human infrastructure. So things like hospitals and emergency response stuff. We'll get into that more, as well as keeping natural infrastructure. And we're looking to align the way we categorize these to the extent possible with the CISA categories, or effectively the approach used for VDEM and what's common in some emergency management contexts. Again, the specific categorization is something we'll get into more at a later date. Next slide. On the hazard data side, we previously in CRMP phase 1 really focused on coastal flooding, understanding both the tidal kind of nuisance flooding, so where high tide and that mean high water lines will change was a big thing, understanding what places will be habitable or not, as well as our more extreme coastal storms where we get to major storm events and who's going to be exposed to hurricanes and the like. So we are using that same data, we're building on it a little bit more, we're updating some of the ways that we're presenting sea level rise and the planning horizons. And we'll have multi-frequency flood data available. That's what we had last time. That's effectively being able to say the difference between the 5-year, 10-year, 100-year, 500-year, like the range of frequencies. On the new addition side, we're looking at precipitation data or rainfall-induced flooding, pluvial flooding. You'll hear all those terms. So this is going to be new data that's incorporated, relying on new precipitation data from Alice 14 and Marissa. And also we'll have multi-frequency flood data available. We'll be able to understand different sizes and of storm event conditions with different frequencies or probabilities attached to them, and how those will change over time. On the riverine side, it's another piece we want to include just to get a fuller picture. But we're not going to be putting the same level of detailed modeling into that. So we're going to be, for now, leveraging the FEMA floodplain, the national flood layers there. That really does focus on just one event condition, that 100-year, 1% annual chance riverine flood. But we will start to look at exploring multi-frequency data in select pilot locations, but it just won't be across the whole study area. Next slide. Next. All right, getting into the methods. This should look somewhat familiar to folks. At a really high level, what we're doing with this impact assessment is we're understanding the different types of flood hazards and how those exist across a range of conditions, both different frequencies and likelihood events, as well as how those are projected to change or increase over time with climate change. And then we're applying that on how it affects assets. We're using the term asset to talk about everything that might be impacted, affected, damaged, disrupted due to flooding. That includes people, but we're looking at people from the perspective of their neighborhoods, their houses, and our economies from the perspective of the infrastructure and things on the ground. And again, that infrastructure we're kind of dividing up to built infrastructure, more human infrastructure, and our natural infrastructure. Next slide. One other piece, when we're looking at the hazard assets, we're also taking into account context to provide more of a contextual understanding, if you will, of what those impacts are. So for that context, we're looking at things like social vulnerability, community resources and capacity, these other pieces that are less about the physical on the ground, but more about the social, environmental, economic context that these intersections of hazards and assets exist in, and how that impacts our overall understanding of what the consequences could be for communities and systems. So we kind of address that separately, but it's really incorporated into our overall arching understanding of how we're measuring impacts. Next slide. So kind of an expanded view of what we talked about before. We're looking at these 3 different hazard types, understanding how they exist across different annual event probabilities, noting that riverine flooding isn't going to exist in all of these probabilities, but to really just focus on that 1% annual chance event. Then we're looking at how that changes across different planning horizons. We're looking at simplifying the planning horizons that are presented from kind of existing, near future, far future, and identifying lower and higher bounds associated with this. So different from before, we kind of had, here's our 2020, 2040, 2060, 2080 specific points, recognizing that projections include uncertainty. There's lower and higher levels that could exist within. We're looking at potentially repackaging the way that information is presented to show those upper and lower bounds. Again, those future conditions will only be for the coastal and rainfall precipitation data, not for the riverine information at this time. And so looking at all those different conditions, how it applies to our different asset categories, as well as our different context and social context categories for that understanding of impacts. Next slide. We're also breaking out impacts into different levels of detail based on the level of information that we have available about the asset or system. Next slide. So generally speaking, if we have the understanding of the hazard, which we will everywhere, and we understand where an asset is on the ground, we can speak to its exposure. So that's the likelihood that it will be wet, more or less, that it'll get flooded. When we understand more about the asset's characteristics, the sensitivity, its adaptive capacity, we can start to get to vulnerability, understand how likely the asset getting wet will impact its ability to function, or to function and do its role. When we have more information about the value of that asset, the extrinsic value and what that impact could be in terms of financial, we're particularly focusing here on financial consequences, getting that down to dollars, then that's what we're calling risk. So sometimes we have more or less information about a different type of asset, and so we might not be able to get as far for everything. So we'll kind of show like that level of detail that can change. And so hopefully this round, some of the ones that we might have only gotten exposure or vulnerability for last time, we'll be able to get more towards vulnerability or risk. So kind of push that continually. Just as an example from last time of what this looks like, especially highlighting that difference between exposure and risk. For buildings, we're looking at building footprints for residential structures here. And in the purple, we can talk to exposure. We can say how many buildings will be affected by different event conditions, will be affected by chronic flooding or extreme flooding, and get that straight count. And there we can see, a significant increase. We have about 150% increase between what buildings would be exposed to that extreme flood, 0.2% annual chance or 500-year flood between 2020 and 2080. But then for buildings, because we know the elevation, the foundation type, the value, the foundation, the elevation type, foundation, elevation, structure type, all those kinds of information, we can start to understand how deep the flooding is, how much damage that'll cause for the structure. If we have an understanding of the value of that structure, then we can start to say what that damage would be, how that would translate into dollar values. And so then our understanding of depth comes into play here, as well as structure characteristics, and we get to a more detailed understanding of the actual risk involved and how that translates to dollars. And while the exposure increases significantly, you see the risk increasing almost exponentially as you take into account that depth and the hazard and vulnerability of the structure itself. All right, so all of our assets, we can have an understanding of how they'll be impacted and speak to that understanding narratively across all of these different hazards. For exposure, again, we'll have multi-frequency information for coastal and precipitation across all assets, and single frequency information for all assets for riverine. When we get to vulnerability, we cut that down a little bit, only some assets, and risk. We're not going to do risk calculations for riverine flooding. And again, that's kind of cut down even more. So just understanding that the level of detail will shift across these categories and based on different asset types. Next slide. I'm going to walk through just a few examples of the basic types of calculations we're doing. So for assessing asset exposure for, say, basic assets here, anything that we can identify just as a point, let's say, we're looking at all the floodplains, all the locations, and then we'll be able to say whether that asset is flooded in any either of conditions, kind of a yes, no. And then we'll be able to simplify that into what we're calling the annual likelihood of flooding, or sometimes we say ALF for our shorthand there. And that speaks to the percentage. It has a 2% chance of flooding in a given year. It has a 0.5% chance of flooding in a given year. And that pretty much speaks to the lowest frequency, highest frequency event that would likely flood that asset. So when we get to that annual likelihood of that asset experience flooding, we can also, that's for an individual asset, and then we can aggregate that over an area of interest, whether that's a county, a census block, anything, or a grid cell or a project area. And that gives us a statistical value of the annualized number of assets expected to experience flooding. That's a statistical value. So if we say 2 hospitals, let's say if we're looking at hospitals, the number is 2. That doesn't mean that there's going to be 2 hospitals flooded every year. That means maybe once every 10 years, there's going to be 20 hospitals flooded. So something in that realm, but it's a way to aggregate this information for use for comparison, prioritization, ranking, etc. All right, next. I spoke about this before when we were looking at like structure risk. We were looking at the depths, the building attributes, and then using these depth damage functions to be able to get that expected damages per event, and then average annualized loss that applies to a structure. And then that can be summed up across an area of interest and aggregated across the whole Commonwealth or coastal region or any specific area. Next slide. And then for some other types of impacts, and I've pulled out here, loss of habitat is an example of tidal habitat. We might look at more of a threshold-based approach for understanding impacts to an area, a land area, or a habitat area. Where, so for this example, we might look at where the wetland habitats are, where tidal thresholds will change, and where we would see that conversion of, let's say, wetland area to open water. We can also integrate an understanding of ecosystem service values. There's some values that are coming out from FEMA for the BCA calculations that can be used to understand either market values or recognize values for certain habitat types. And then to that, we can talk to the loss of habitat land area, as well as the loss of ecosystem services provided by those wetlands, and be able to translate that into a dollar value as well. Next. All right. Now we're getting into this list of the data resources that we're looking to bring into each of these each of these components. So right here on the screen, we have the data resources we're looking to understand community resources. Again, that's the pieces relating to, we have the top population. So we're looking to attribute building footprints with population information from the census to get an understanding of the number of people who are exposed in a given event. We can simplify that to understanding their annual likelihood of flooding for an individual person or structure. And then that can help us get a annualized number of people exposed to flooding and kind of can combine those factors there. Can also look at population displacement as that relates similar to what I just talked about for tidal habitat impacts. We're looking at areas that will become uninhabitable due to frequent inundation, and can start to speak to that from a implications for population displacement. In addition, we're looking at building footprints, getting just an understanding of, for residential buildings and non-residential buildings, their exposure risk there from the damages dollars perspective. Can also, another piece here is tribal owned lands. We are looking at federally and state recognized tribal boundaries, and can also pull out specifics to understanding the buildings on those lands. So we can get both an understanding of how many acres would be inundated, if there's land that'll be lost, converted to open water, and if they're in the specific structures and damages that relates to that land. And then we also have 4 additional things we're looking to bring in here. Existing indexes like the Cultural Resource Preservation Index, Nature-Based Recreation Access, Development Vulnerability Model, and Watershed Impact Model are all other pieces we're looking to bring in and be able to compare that information to exposure and flood exposure that intersects there. So I'm going to pause here for any thoughts and reflections. This is really the time when we're looking for input on what might be missing, what more you'd want to see. I don't know if Matt or Carolyn have anything further to add there, so I'll just pause here for reflections from the TAC. This is just focused on community resources.
I'm just curious. So on things like population displacement or inundated acres, are those permanent, or they also include like riverine or rainfall driven events that are temporary?
Yeah, so that's a great question. For inundated acres, or anything that's just straight exposure, that is looking at the range of conditions. So we would have inundated acres for every event, event condition over every time horizon. In order to synthesize that information for comparison across time horizons, that's when we would get to annualized inundated acres. Looking at something like population displacement and land lost, that's specifically looking at areas projected to be permanently inundated or converted to like looking at, I think, mean high water as that threshold. And saying that is land that would be uninhabitable or not functioning, unable to function the way it currently is in a no action scenario.
From DCR side, I just want to add, we are speaking with the tribes. We presented to the federally recognized tribes earlier this week and shared that we were looking at doing this type of impact assessment. We are working on getting their feedback and trying to get their feedback specifically on the question of, is this the right way to go about doing impacts for your land and your structures? So we're working on that.
Any other thoughts here?
Yeah, I just this Jack Filikowski, American Flood Coalition. I just had a thought or question on how y'all might be thinking about some of those damages or the annualized average annualized losses, and maybe normalizing those for the community, right? Some of that sort of percentage of assets at risk or damage at risk, anything like that, just to maybe squash some of those differences just from those places that have lots of people and things.
Yeah, I think we're producing the data in a way that can be done. I think the key thing here is getting an understanding of what processes will be running, what the GIS-based analyses will be. But because we will also have those total number of assets in a given area, or total number of structures, or even just there's a difference between average annualized loss, capturing that as $1 versus normalized to structure values, so that you're not overly valuing high valued areas disproportionately. So we will do all of this detail, but all of that content will be there to adjust how that's being displayed. We go ahead and move on to the next slide. We can start looking through this more, but the opportunity to go back and forward as we get through this. Split this up into 2 slides here, but on the built infrastructure slide, mentioned before, we're looking to align it with the with a set of critical infrastructure categories that's been defined elsewhere. For that, there's different critical infrastructure sectors. So that includes commercial sector, where we do have a similar to the last listed on the last slide, commercial understanding of like which buildings are commercials by the parcels and building footprints. And then other types of asset data we're primarily getting from Highfeld, Homeland. I don't remember what that acronym is, sorry. But Highfeld data source, which was the key data source we used last time, understanding assets related to communication, phone, radio, TV, internet, looking to add a couple new ones like EPA Toxic Substances Control Act facilities. So those are areas with potential kind of chemical contaminants and toxins. Looking at DoD sites and DoD land, electric substations and power plants, nuclear power plants. Last time that was included, but it was wrapped up within the regular energy sector. So potentially being able to split that out a bit more readily. Looking at other energy related stuff like petroleum and natural gas infrastructure. We had petroleum last time, looking to integrate more natural gas this time as well. So those highlighted ones are newer sources here. We're going to go to the next slide just to view it. So continued other things on the built infrastructure side, looking at manufacturing facilities, transportation-based facilities, including airports, freight and shipping information, adding bus stations this time, which is not last time, roadways, general roadways, as well as a bigger focus on evacuation routes, hazardous waste generator, solid waste and waste treatment facilities. And then we've listed a couple here for input and discussion, including septic systems and public water supply. So starting with septic systems, that's one that we included last time, has a major impact, kind of dominated the data the way it was presented, because that is so prevalent, but also mostly privately owned rather than more of a publicly owned and managed system like some of these other ones. And then public water supply put in here, that's something that was brought up. There is some data that's available there, but there's not a lot of clarity on exactly what specific asset data we might want to pull in to support that kind of analysis. I'll pause here again for any additions or reflections on this list when it comes to built infrastructure.
So here, Johanna mentioned that these kind of the way that we're thinking about ultimately grouping, which we're not necessarily talking about right now, grouping these assets is being taken from BDM. BDM is standing up a new critical infrastructure working group, which is comprising state agency kind of regulators and owners, and then also private owners of these different critical infrastructure assets. That meeting is happening in a couple of weeks later this month, the kickoff meeting. So we're hoping to kind of look to that group and to BDM for guidance and leadership in the state around identifying the asset data. That's not going to be possible for this plan just because of the timeline of when that group is getting kicked off and when we need to complete this plan, but ultimately in the future, for future iterations of this plan and other flood resilience work coming out of DCR, we want them to really be the owners of saying, here is the authoritative asset data for critical infrastructure in the Commonwealth, which is why we are moving towards aligning our approach with the approach that they're taking for this work.
So can you elaborate on their new committee? Is it state agencies or is it local governments or?
My understanding is that it is just state agencies and other critical infrastructure owners. Like I think they're planning to have like utility providers like Dominion come and sit on it as well. So I think it is, I don't think there are local governments involved in that at the moment, but we'll see how it evolves because it really is just kind of the first kickoff meeting is happening, and we can certainly report back out to the TAC and to the subcommittee about how that goes and what we learned from the meeting.
Okay, so in terms of this process, when you say the septic systems and public water supply are for discussion, like, are you looking for better data sources?
So on the septic system, I mean, we received data from VDH in phase 1, where they had a known address where a septic tank existed or a private water well existed. Those were geolocated based on the address. It aligns with a lot of our residential impacts. What we're trying to avoid is duplicating some of the work. And we know that VIMS is doing a lot of work with septic exposure and vulnerability, especially with respect to sea level rise. And so this is one of the questions. It's not that we ignore septic impacts in phase 2. We still speak to it, but do we do our own analysis based on what we had from VDH, or do we refer to the VIMS work and highlight the work that they're currently doing and continue to do? And And that's what we're trying to understand from the subcommittee and from our stakeholders. Is what the VIMS work doing, is that sufficient? Is that meeting your needs? Do you think we need additional analysis on septic? We do know that there are some data limitations there, but that's what, we don't want to duplicate it without people really asking for us to do this work and sit on really identifying what the need is, so we better understand it and can try to meet that need either individually or working with VIMS on what they're doing as well.
So I'm not sure I know. I have an up-to-date idea of what VIMS is doing. The last time I heard about it, I would have said it might not have been adequate, but did you all have a briefing? I know Ben and I kind of are tag teaming this, but have they talked about that recently? Because it looked like the last time it was more March migration.
I didn't catch the end of that, more marsh migration, is that what you said?
Yeah.
I mean, Molly at VIMS is working on updating the wastewater vulnerability viewer. I believe it just started in Middle Peninsula, but they're expanding that across the coastal zone.
We haven't had an update though, Whitney, to this subcommittee on that work. If that's of interest, we could certainly, I don't know. It might be something that maybe we could send out an update electronically so that everybody is on the same page about what they are working on and where they're at with that work to compare it to what we might be able to produce with this plan.
Mary Carson added that septic project is different than marsh migration project.
Yeah, I was just confirming. I didn't know if there was a previous meeting where they talked about it, but yeah, it would be nice to have the sort of a quick description of the, well, actually, I probably don't want a quick description. I probably want a thorough description of their data sources, because honestly, that's been part of the issue, is the quality of the data, and then the assumptions built into the analysis. And then I'll just say, like, it's odd for public water supply. I would have thought you'd go to DEQ because DEQ is the one that required water supply planning documents. But I maybe I don't know what I'm looking for.
Yeah, we have the public water supply locations from VDH. They're actually one of the more proactive agencies that send it to us every 6 months, an updated data set. So we do have that information.
And
So-
Mary Carson, I agree, the septic issue is critical to the built infrastructure conversation, so having an update on the work underway would be helpful.
Okay. Whitney, go ahead.
The other thing is, the water systems had to do reports to the feds. I'm trying to think what it's called, on their vulnerability. So they probably won't share them with you, but they probably could answer questions about how you define what's at risk in terms of if you're talking about the like reservoirs versus the equipment in a treatment facility. And it'll come to me in a minute what that's called, but anyway.
Okay, that is helpful. I think we could potentially, as you said, they might not be willing to share, but it's something we could highlight as, something that has already been done in the region and the plan, certainly.
Yeah, and I think just looking at waste, HRSD has done a lot of work in this space as well. We're not looking to duplicate their work, but again, potentially highlighting the work that they've already done to help share that in the plan. And I think that's a new approach that we're taking with phase 2, is to leverage the work that's been done by others and really highlight it and give them the credit for the work that they've done. And that's another opportunity to do that in this grouping as well.
Yeah, I think it would be a similar approach for VDOT. I know Chris is on the line. We know, and we've talked previously with this group, that they're doing their own analysis. We've discussed that VDOT's preference would be to still include roadways, and related kind of high-level overview in this plan, but, again, point to the fact that they're.
Caroline, can you, sorry, can you step closer to one of the microphones? I think you cut out there for
Yeah.
folks who are online. Thank
Sorry,
you.
yeah, I was just saying, I think, it would be a similar approach with VDOT, where we know that they're doing additional analysis that is more detailed than what we're gonna produce in this plan, and they're looking statewide. But, you know, their guidance, and Chris is on the line, has been to, still include it in this plan so that we are highlighting the challenge, at a high level, and then point to that additional work that they're doing in more detail.
Yeah, that's correct, Carolyn. Thank you for summarizing that. That was our recommendation and position.
Hey,
Any
should
other-
I move on, maybe?
Right. On the human infrastructure side here, looking at kind of on the context of food, things like public refrigerated warehouses, the new source integrate. Agriculture as well, we have, building footprints and information from agricultural parcels. Hospitals, emergency operations centers, emergency shelters, EMS, fire stations, police stations, state government buildings. I believe we're taking, last time we also looked at federal government buildings within the Commonwealth, and we're taking that out. Childcare facilities, schools, including higher ed facilities, and also adding supplemental colleges and potentially in banks as well.
If I may add, Whitney added to the chat that AWIA was the federal requirement for water systems. She provided the link, and we'll make sure that goes into the minutes.
Any comments or questions here?
Right. On the natural infrastructure side, we have a handful of sources we're looking for on the left side. You can see that speaks to the types of natural infrastructure and land coverage that exists. We're also looking at other ways to classify and categorize natural infrastructure and land areas based on these other indices and studies that have been done. We'll say this is looking to be a non-hierarchical approach, or otherwise, like, there's going to be an accepted kind of duplication of assets that might appear in some of these different data sources. So that it'll just be presented kind of separately. But for each of these categories of understanding and classifying our land areas, we're looking to understand the acres of land or habitat area that are exposed to flooding under each specific condition, being able to synthesize that for a specific time horizon as needed for that kind of annualized inundated acres metric. Again, that's really what's helpful for using for mapping and comparison across different event conditions. Also looking to understand with our understanding of the sensitivity of some of these habitats, we can look to start to measure the type of habitat that might be lost or change. So for intertidal areas, we can look at areas that might be lost from tidal to open water, looking at mean low water. Can also look at acres of habitat that are upland habitat lost to more tidal conditions, looking at that 1.5 times mean tidal rate or something in that zone. Understanding again that habitat that might be threatened and not able to exist in its current form and function, as well as a synthesis of that change in acreage, habitat acreage, or tidal acreage that affects, again, all of these different categories on the left-hand side. And then to the extent possible, when we have that understanding of how habitat areas might be lost or changed, we can get that valuation of ecosystem services that are lost by applying certain FEMA values there.
So I just want to acknowledge and share that Matt and I had conversations with a variety of folks around this between the time that we last met as a subcommittee and this meeting. We spoke with Wetlands Watch, we spoke with folks within DCR Natural Heritage, where a lot of this data is coming from. We spoke with BIMS, and so hopefully this captures and includes a lot of that feedback that we heard from you all in developing this revised approach to natural infrastructure in the plan. Right.
All right. Another piece. Oh, sorry. All right. Another piece looking at for community context, we want to talk about how we're looking at social vulnerability. So on the left-hand side, you can see kinds of maps that we were able to produce in the last version of the CRMP, where with the gridded cells that we used to synthesize all impacts for mapping, we were able to look at social vulnerability and how that intersects with coastal flood hazard to identify those areas that have high vulnerability and hazard and maybe risk that might be otherwise overlooked, especially in areas that don't have the most infrastructure, like some of the the peninsulas and the eastern shore, etc. Should we go down 2 slides? Sorry. There you go. So for context of a bit more of how we did the demographic mapping and modeling last time, we looked at residential buildings and data around population that was either available at the census block or block group level or the census tract level. So different information is available at different scales, and use that to have a household level approximation of household demographics. So that might be it's very statistical. So you might have 1.72 people living in a structure with a percentage of a racial makeup. But again, we're using that for that statistical modeling based on where houses are, not just where census tracts are, which can be very big and maybe misleading, especially in some of these rural areas. With that, we applied the CDC Social Vulnerability Index methodology that's used in the FEMA's National Risk Index, if you're familiar with that, that's used in, that's referenced in the CFPF and some other programs, that's an existing index that's available at the tract level. So we applied that methodology and downscaled it so that we could get an understanding of vulnerability at the household, approximation vulnerability at the household level, and the ability to summarize that at the block level or any area of interest. Again, that means you can draw any kind of polygon or line and get an understanding of what the social vulnerability is of that area, custom area, and how that is different from the Commonwealth as a whole. And again, we pulled in some demographic information that was available at the block level to fill that out and get a bit more of a granular view there. So going back 1 slide, right, should be in order. We do recognize that index then does look different. So even though the core methodology is consistent, the actual results do look different than what is seen in the National Risk Index, that's CDC Social Vulnerability Index, which is available at the census tract scale. So there are certain tracts that are kind of divided up because the population counts or the racial demographics of folks are not consistent across the tracts, and we were able to account for that, but it does lead to a slight inconsistency across those 2 sources because of this more downscaled method. So I think a question here for the TAC is whether that downscaled method is something that should continue and feels worthwhile. An alternative is just to apply the CDC Social Vulnerability Index, which again is used in these other metrics, and just kind of take that straight one for just increased consistency, even with a potential loss of granularity. I'll also say for the, like on the left-hand side, you can see it's these grid cells, and there's no grid cell where there isn't people living, and so that's why it looks patchier. Of course, it could also be represented at the block or block group or tract scale as well. And one other thing to note, if you're comparing these two images, is that the census tract boundaries have changed between what we used in 2010 versus 2020. So that's why some of these areas are a little hard to compare this current data. So I'll pause there, looking for thoughts and reactions. Again, I'm doing a more down-sampled method that we used last time versus maybe just more holistically integrating the existing index. And Caroline, if anyone has anything to add to that as well.
Yeah, I'll just add that in either option, we would still be doing the intersection of coastal hazard and vulnerability data that you see here, which is somewhat unique to this plan. You know, having both together, I think is a benefit of the plan. So we would still do that. It's just the question is, do we do that? Which way do we do that? And the data we do want, we've heard feedback that we should be consistent with what's being used for the Community Flood Preparedness Fund. So that's why we're considering continuing to use the CDC SVI for that approach.
Any thoughts? I mean, with the rasterized cell, it's more local. And so you have a more localized flood exposure versus kind of a flood exposure that you're doing, I think, in the larger block groups. So it's synthetic data, but we're trying to get beyond what's available. I don't know if you all felt that the raster data was helpful from phase one, and if that's something we want to update with the updated census data and vulnerability data, or do we want to still update the population but produce something at a larger scale to help convey the risk? And the matrix of vulnerability and flood hazard, we used a 5x5 grid, so there's 25 different options within there. That's flexible. That could be a 3x3 or 4x4. If that's too much, we could try to simplify it to try to really get at the top right corner of the intersection of flood hazard and social vulnerability.
All right, so I know y'all are looking for feedback, and this is kind of a hard call, but I almost feel like if you use the granular data, it tells you maybe more about where there's real vulnerability. If you use the higher level, you're really just saying, where are you most eligible to qualify for money? Which, I mean, is useful too, but that some of that really high, higher scale data, I feel like you just end up kind of checking a box to say, oh, good, I'm in one of those census blocks or whatever. I know that's not
I'll say to that, no, that's helpful. It's kind of like we'd love to have both, but we are looking at on the figure on the right in the funding subcommittee. We're talking about trying to pull in all of the different funding sources and how they're prioritizing funding, especially with demographics and some of the EJ screen tools, to help provide additional context as to where, not only where the state is directing money, but where are there federal resources directing money and at what scale. So still to have that as a resource for people to use, and then, but for our own analysis, should we be looking to try to get a little more granular to figure out where within those overall areas the need may exist. And this is where we really need our local partners and regional partners that know the areas better than us, and then that know it better than how the data shows it, to kind of verify if that is a very socially vulnerable area that does need attention.
Mayor Carson?
I agree with Whitney. I think that if the funding subcommittee is looking at how to ensure that the users of the data have access to the right tools to make sure their applications are sufficient and correct, then we should shift our focus for the purpose of this work group to as granular as possible. We don't need to have that checked box available if it's going to be available somewhere else. So I would say as localized, as specific as possible should be the goal to this community context. Kind of graphic. I think that your suggestion to reduce the number of squares for simplicity purposes is a good one. I think that it could be more likely to be used if it's a clearer, if there are fewer options for the measurement. And then the last thing that I was going to say, this idea of asking for locality vetting of the vulnerability data when we get down to as granular as possible is an excellent one. Only communities are familiar to the degree that they need to be to validate the vulnerability information, but the amount of time that will require and the attention is so vast. And I think that it'd be a tall order to ask our communities to provide that gut check and that validation. It's almost as though that could be, excuse me, a project that is enormous and would require its own line item of funding, and you'd have to be able to, offer some compensation to the local staff or the PDCs or whomever you're asking for this validation. So I don't know if that's within the realm of possible for it to be done in a way that is representative of each region. You might get some communities that'll participate and others that won't, and then that would skew the data or the accuracy of the data. Sorry, let's stop talking. Thank you.
No, and to your point about the validation, I don't think it's likely that we can get that done for this plan. But I think if we do this analysis, right, it's not just the end of the work. There's still more work. This is data that we're providing to then make its way into local planning efforts. And in that stage, when they're incorporating this data, that's when they're doing the check. And I think we can try to work and receive feedback to understand where the challenges are with the data. But it's hard to I don't think we can go in there changing this cell from orange to yellow just based on community input across the board by December of this year. That's just not feasible. But we do have to know that it is just a model with synthetic data, and that we acknowledge that, put that into the limitations, put that into the guidance too, as for how people use this plan, that we know this is just model data. Here are some recommendations to please review these areas, your community, and try to highlight how they can still use this to inform that decision making, but this isn't the only source of input to inform their decisions.
Jack Rolkowski has his hand raised.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think just the only additional comment I might add is I think there's something to be thoughtful about. Whoever whatever raster cell is shown is kind of the lower and the lower end, in the macro sense, is still actually kind of highly exposed to flooding, right? Like this is a self-selected group that is actually highly exposed. And so sort of just being thoughtful about saying the sort of least at-risk member cell of this group is still comparatively at high risk, and not just having that message not sort of being conveyed. I would, because you think, especially in the shoes of a local government, you say, hey, I still feel pretty exposed down here, right? And so just sort of thinking about any inadvertent communication there, recognizing that this is a sort of a self-selected group that is highly exposed, and then ranking therein is relevant, but it doesn't mean, you know, they're at zero risk type concept. And I don't really mean that from the risk communication, more from just the credibility with the local partners as you're ground truthing some of these results.
Thanks, Jack.
Okay, is there any other feedback on this or any of the other content that we've gone over before we go to next steps? All right.
All right, this was kind of brought up before, just giving everyone an update. This is, we'll be finalizing our look at the asset and infrastructure and data we're pulling in to compile our phase 2 database, and that review and creation is going on over the next month or so. And then after that, and also once the hazard data is really ready to go, we'll be executing that core piece of the assessment, and able to start to summarize the initial results. And at that point in time is when we'll be looking for more validation and review, and looking on how to kind of categorize, classify, kind of further present some of this information. And that'll kind of go on through June or so.
Okay. So just to kind of summarize, I think the main point of feedback in terms of we need more information is on the septic information. So what is VIMS already doing that we may want to reference instead of doing our own analysis, or do we want to do our own analysis? So we'll follow up and distribute information that we're able to gather on that before our next meeting, so you all can provide some feedback electronically on that decision. If you go through the slides and you have other questions or feedback on the asset data that we are pulling in or the metrics we're planning to produce, please reach out to us, Matt and me, to share that feedback. We are moving ahead with the impact assessment, so we do want to get any input that you all have on this asset data now, just so we do have that kind of base database of information from which to draw as we start to organize and synthesize the impact assessment outputs in the plan. All right, so can you all online hear me okay if I'm standing over here talking? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to switch gears now and talk about the impact assessment side of, or sorry, not the impact assessment, the projects and initiatives side of things. So let me just get my screen organized. Okay, so as we talked about at the top of the meeting, this subcommittee is tasked with supporting both the impact assessment and also this projects and initiatives inventory, or planned resilience actions analysis, as we were calling it in the plan. So I wanted to start with just giving some reminders about how we've gone about collecting projects and initiatives data so far. We did our initial development of that inventory back in August 2021 with the phase 1 plan, where we requested information about projects and initiatives from primarily, I think, planning district commissions and localities at that time. Then in August of this past year, we did a second kind of bulk upload of that information. Again, requested that PDCs help us out with that. 6 of the 8 PDCs submitted updates from their respective localities, which are included in our Web Explorer at this time. Shortly thereafter, we did launch our new user portal for the Web Explorer, which allows owners of projects and initiatives to sign up and then actually edit and update and add project and initiative information directly to be able to update their information on a more ongoing basis, including for our phase 2 plan. The deadline for submitting projects or letting us know that you need help with getting those projects into the Web Explorer is April 1st of this year. We'll talk more about some of the next steps to come. But so far, what do we have in the Web Explorer? So here's an update on where we're at with projects and initiatives. We do have currently a total of 660 projects and initiatives in the Web Explorer. I want to note that this includes all the projects and initiatives that appeared during the phase 1 plan update, plus additions that we've received since then. So the map here shows projects and initiatives that are owned by PDCs, cities, counties, and towns, organized geographically. So right now we have a lot of data from Hampton Roads, but this is all data since the phase 1 plan because that region did not update yet for the phase 2 plan. We're working with them on that. We can see for some of our more rural areas like George Washington Regional Commission and like the Eastern Shore, the Planning District Commission is taking on a lot of the work to either develop projects or submit projects and initiatives on behalf of the region, rather than the locality doing that themselves. However, on the flip side, that's not for the case in like Northern Virginia or Hampton Roads. We do have some gaps in coverage still in areas that don't have coastal flood issues, which is perhaps not surprising. As we work on shifting our focus in this plan from coastal flood hazard to all forms of flooding, we're hoping to better kind of brand and market this tool to be something that is more relevant to those localities. And then we also see some of those PDCs and localities where there is maybe coastal flood risk existing, but we still don't have projects and initiative information from the PDC or the locality. So for example, Isle of Wight County or Surrey County or perhaps Lancaster County. PDCs and local governments are only one of our plan end users. So we're also looking to help get state agencies to see some value in sharing their ongoing work across the region here in the Web Explorer. So obviously right now this is a gap. We have very few projects and initiatives in there from state agencies. Similarly, we do not have input in this from tribal governments. We do know that that might be a gap that we never fill just because of their, you know, what they would like to share with the public and what they don't want to share with the public. But that is kind of the status looking across these different end users of what is currently in our inventory. Also importantly, you know, the number of projects and initiatives is only one way to slice this data. In some cases, there are projects like in the Middle Peninsula where there's very few number of projects, but the dollar value shows that there is more complexity and more cost involved with those smaller number of initiatives. So by the flood in the Middle Peninsula case. There's also just general discrepancies in available cost data included. We have for Virginia Beach, for example, has $3.83 billion across 73 different projects and initiatives. Norfolk has $1.95 billion across 55. In comparison, you know, Greensville County and Petersburg have 15,000 each for one project or initiative. So there is still a lot of gap when we look at cost data where we've got information about projects and initiatives, but maybe we just don't have the cost data in there yet. So that's all the data we currently have available in the Web Explorer to draw from. We're working on increasing that and trying to get more information as we work ahead to the April 1st deadline, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But I did also want to present some information about how we shared projects and initiatives in the phase 1 plan so that we can talk about how we want to present them in the phase 2 plan. So this is our description from the phase 1 plan of why we were including projects and initiatives. We did emphasize prioritizing projects and initiatives. This, as you all know, was not accomplished with the phase 1 plan and not something that we're looking to accomplish with phase 2. So here we're looking at identifying best practices and determining areas and assets that lack projects and initiatives and potentially require additional resources. Some of the challenges from phase one are called out on the right. The data call was open for a relatively short time frame. That's not been the case with phase two. We have the projects and initiatives data call has been open for several months now and will be open through April 1st. Not all project owners were able to respond within that time frame. Again, here we're trying to mitigate some of that by offering technical assistance to localities to help them get their projects and initiatives into the database, and also to planning district commissions and state agencies if they need it. Project footprints and other details were inconsistently defined, inadequate time to vet and refine info with project owners, and then gaps analysis was limited to coastal impacts. So on the third and fourth bullet, these are things that I think we still need to work through and discuss with the subcommittee. And then on the fifth bullet, the last bullet on the gaps analysis, we are ahead, again, looking ahead with this plan, looking at a variety of different types of flood impacts that will be extended into this analysis for gaps and opportunities and projects and initiatives. So this is just a snapshot of how we presented capacity building and planning needs, or kind of the initiative side in the phase one plan. This is one way it was presented in the plan. And then here's another example of how we presented projects in the plan. I do have a couple of copies of the plan here if anybody wants to look through what it looks like as a whole in this section. But we, called out the number and the different types across different kind of groupings of regions in the phase one plan. We also had some maps showing the geographic distribution of projects and initiatives. You can see initiatives on the left-hand side there, again, kind of showing across the whole geography of a locality. And then on the right-hand side, information about the projects. And here's where the kind of the footprint, having the footprint data and that comment about the footprint data being inconsistently defined did kind of matter in how these were reflected across in the maps for the region. For the gaps analysis side of things, on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see here gaps analysis for natural infrastructure. So we've called out some impact hotspots from our impact assessment, and then also the project footprints itself from that last slide. These would be related to natural infrastructure. And so you can see here that it's kind of hard to tell what the gaps are. I've done some call outs for some things that are assets that do not have a project or an initiative on the right-hand side to address the challenges. But those call outs were my additions in these slides. They weren't included in the plan itself. So in the phase one plan, the TAC project subcommittee did make some recommendations, which I thought were kind of relevant to our discussion on how to incorporate projects and initiatives into the phase two plan. You can see them on the screen here. There was interest in having some more reflection of not just public needs, but also private needs, incorporating an objective review for potential overvaluation of project benefits. Again, with all forms of flooding, identifying new actions rather than only compiling existing ones, and then providing guidance regarding the types and location of projects to advance our goals as a Commonwealth. So we're not going to be able to address all of these recommendations with the phase two plan, but I think it's worth kind of thinking through where we can make some progress towards maybe addressing some of the underlying kind of basis for these concerns. And also, as you all are working on your recommendations for future planning, I think this is perhaps a starting point for our continued conversations. So again, we recognize that the initial challenge is kind of the gaps in the inventory and trying to fill those gaps in the inventory. So as I mentioned, we are bringing on consultant support to help us with that. And that contractor will be responsible for supporting with these tasks. So firstly, filling our data gaps and deciding how data should be analyzed and presented, then actually going through and analyzing the data that we have. And then finally presenting that data in the plan and also in the Coastal Resilience Web Explorer. So as I mentioned at the top of this meeting, we'll continue talking about this topic in future meetings as this is kind of setting up the conversation and starting to get your feedback on what the contractor should bring when they come to present their initial kind of findings from that further review of what's in the Web Explorer, and also start to think about how to present the data in the plan. So, this slide tries to summarize some opportunities for improving or changing our projects and initiatives analysis in phase two. We can summarize some information about the number, cost, and type of action across localities, watersheds, planning district commissions, and across the whole region. We can identify areas with actions that are at a high flood risk across multiple planning horizons, and then look at, you know, where those areas intersect with our existing projects and initiatives and where they don't. We can identify common themes and classes and types of actions across the region, and potentially look at areas for potential coordination or collaboration based on geographic proximity and action type for projects and initiatives in Explorer. On the right-hand side, you can see the list of fields, some of the fields, I think some of the most critical fields that we are collecting with the user portal. So this is kind of a baseline for what data we have on these projects and initiatives. And the question I have for you all is, you know, what does the subcommittee think should be included in phase two? Any feedback on these bullets, or is there additional topics you all would like to see? We don't necessarily need to answer that question now, but these are things to consider for our next meeting. This is a picture of the kind of example projects that were included in the phase two plan. So it wasn't just that analysis, it was also calling out featured projects that were identified based on a collaborative kind of review of projects and initiatives submitted to the plan. So should the phase two plan include the same kind of approach to calling out examples of projects and initiatives? If so, should they be incorporated in a similar way? And then how should we go about actually selecting which ones to include? Looks like I got disconnected from the Zoom, so it's going to give it a second to rejoin.
You're still there. Try reconnecting.
Working on it. Sorry, everybody. Thanks for your patience.
Carolyn, are you asking for feedback from the subcommittee now on those slides that you just presented, or are we waiting and then we'll provide feedback?
Love any feedback that you all have now would be great. I think so. At our next meeting, we'll hopefully have the contractor here to talk about what they've been able to do in terms of analyzing what we've already got in the inventory and what has come in since today. And then start presenting on how they think we could summarize some of that data in the phase two plan. So any feedback that you all have in advance of them doing that work would be helpful to help guide their approach and direct them in a particular way, rather than just being reactionary to what they come to the next meeting to share. So I don't know if y'all can hear me online. I disconnected from the Zoom, so I know I'm not sharing my screen anymore, and I'm having trouble reconnecting. But yeah, any input on that topic now on any of these topics now would be great, and we can share it with the contractor to share at our next meeting.
So, what the slide that you had that showed the recommendations from phase one. So 4 bullets or something like that. I think it's like 3 back for where you are now, maybe 4.
Which one?
Yes, oh, 1 more over. Okay, yes. So, right, so the last bullet here. So to me, this is where the rubber hits the road, right? I mean, we've spent phase one, we've spent really the framework, which came before the phase one plan, kind of assessing where we are and then doing the projections for where we'll be. So that work is so critical, and I think you know, we've done it enough, or we will do it enough. To me, where I think the TAC members and the subcommittee members can be most useful is discerning how we synthesize what we've learned into recommendations for moving forward. And I'm not sure is that something that the contractors are going to do, or is that something that subcommittee members as subject matter experts, we're going to be helping inform and create these recommendations, this guidance? Because it seems like we need to move into we got all this information, now here's the direction in which we think the Commonwealth should go in the coastal zone. And I'm not sure like how we do that. Can we have a working session where we're doing nothing but just talking about what types of projects should be prioritized and how we work through like location and for, the different goals of, a project, you do X, Y, and Z for, I just feel like there's so much workshopping that needs to be done. And I don't know how we're supposed to do that as committee members and if the contractors are supposed to direct us in that. But it seems like working time where we're sitting in a room and hashing it out based off of all the work that's been done so far is really critical in what I kind of imagine the work group doing.
That's great feedback. Yeah, I think to partially answer your question, so I think some of that is really going to be encompassed in the TAC subcommittee's recommendations. So our next meeting, what's on kind of the schedule to do is to hear an update from the contractor about what project and initiative information we have collected from others through kind of the update process and their recommendations for how to summarize that in the plan, but then also to, as you're saying, have a more collaborative brainstorming working session to start talking about the TAC subcommittee's recommendations for planning. And I think that those, we're open at the moment about what those recommendations are going to look like. We do want this to be kind of a facilitated process with you all, kind of what you're describing, MC, of having a more collaborative space to talk through and workshop and figure out what those recommendations should look like. And I think it is possible to have them go in the direction of this final bullet to help provide some of the subcommittee's inputs on how you all feel the Commonwealth should be prioritizing projects and initiatives in the region.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I'm concerned that we won't, have the dedicated time to really get to solid recommendations if we don't have full, clear meeting time where that's, kind of all we're focused on. And I just know what it feels like at the end of the TAC last go round under the Northam administration. Everything was so rushed, and then our recommendations were, I think they were weakened because the process didn't give us breathing room to really focus on what I think our objectives should be as committee members, which is, helping create consensus around how to move forward and actually do implementation.
I know we're coming up here on public comment. Do we have anybody signed up?
No one has responded. They would like to speak.
There's no one in the room that would like to make public comment. Yeah. Okay. Marcus, as co-chair, are you okay with us continuing this discussion?
Of course.
Okay.
Somebody raised their hand. Whitney raised her hand.
Whitney, go ahead.
So I think I'm trying to understand like what kind of recommendations we'd be even contemplating, but one thing we really haven't done, I don't think in any of these meetings and such as to look at the, say that index of flood risk and social vulnerability and say, where there are no projects. And sort of debate that, like, well, you know, is there a need that isn't being met? I think that would be helpful. The other thing maybe we need to debate is whether or not it makes sense for the state or the subcommittee or whatever you want to say to look at existing projects and say that's not the right kind. Certainly as a PDC, we don't usually do that, right? And it causes a lot of controversy. But I think those are the two areas where if you wanted to have a more meaningful workshop, we might want to talk about that.
Yeah, so to the first part of that, I agree. I think having the kind of some of the gaps analysis to inform the subcommittee before you all need to finish your recommendations would definitely be helpful. And that's something we hope to be able to provide you in the upcoming meetings. And then, MC, I realize I agree with your comments that it is going to be tight. With just using the subcommittee meetings that we have remaining and the time that we have for them. But we do plan to spend the next 3 meetings on those subcommittee recommendations and the final meeting to spend the entire meeting on the subcommittee recommendations. So I wasn't here for the phase 1 process. I don't know when you all started talking about recommendations and how this compares. But hopefully having carved out dedicated time in the next 3 meetings will make it feel less rushed. But if that's not the case, please, I'm open to your feedback on that.
Okay, no, I think that's good. I think having the next 2 meetings will be really helpful. And I completely understand, Whitney, your point, absolutely. And I'm not saying that we're gonna get as granular as to make kind of recommendations based off of individual projects. I think just more of a sweeping consideration is sort of where I was thinking. And I have some ideas for how we can create some recommendations that are general, but I think more specific than what we have to date, which is sort of where I'm thinking we would end up.
I just want to wrap up. I know I had the internet issues that prevented me from getting to this slide, which is just sharing that we are also we're going to be working on updating the Coastal Resilience Web Explorer. So one thing the subcommittee might want to consider in your recommendations, and as we look forward to future plans, how could this inventory as we present it in the Web Explorer itself be improved? Are there ways that we could change this and make it look differently to better support knowledge sharing and that goal?
Emily would like to speak if it's possible.
Okay. Great. Well, that was all of my slides. So let's go ahead and have public, I'm assuming this is public comment.
Yes.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do this, public comment.
Emily, you should have.
Hey, Emily Steinhover, Environmental Defense Fund. I think I'm unmuted. I did, in addition to commenting, want to flag for the group that the chat is disabled. So asking folks to comment in the chat, they cannot reply even if you are direct messaging them. It's not feasible to reply. So the raise hand feature does work, for the record. And then we can send additional follow-up comments, but I would like to support Mary Carson's comments about the timeline last time and including time for really robust discussion, particularly on this topic. It got really crunched into effectively the last month, last time, when all of these good pieces came out. But we'll send follow-up comments later. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Emily. Okay, so, I'm gonna go back to this slide. At our next meeting, when we start talking about the projects and initiatives in more detail and start trying to answer some of these questions and also discuss the subcommittee's recommendations, I think what would be helpful from you all to know is this the type of analysis information that you think will help support the kind of recommendations you're currently thinking about making in this plan? Are there other types of analysis that would be helpful for us to bring to that meeting? So Whitney, you identified kind of that gaps analysis. Is there anything else that you all think would be helpful? Okay. Well, if you do think of something, feel free to reach out. We can certainly discuss it with the consultant as they come on board and try to get as much as we can ready for our next meeting for you all to consider. And we'll certainly look back through this conversation and try to be thoughtful about how we're presenting the information in a way that can help to address some of the desired direction for the conversation around recommendations. All right. So that is all we've got in terms of the slides. Please, if you can, take a look at the both the end user survey results and the phase 1 recommendations handout. The phase 1 recommendations handout includes some of those bullets from the phase 1 plan project subcommittee, but also a couple of the other subcommittees that might be relevant to this. I think in order to have those robust and productive conversations, it's very helpful if you all can come to the meeting. I know we only have kind of a limited amount of time together, so it's helpful if you can come to the meeting with some ideas already in mind of where you want this conversation to go. You're always welcome to send those to us ahead of time, make any recommendations for agenda content. But having some of that kind of ideas in mind about what was discussed during the last plan, I think would be helpful prior to our next meeting. So that meeting, we'll do some brief updates on the impact assessment. We'll talk about the report out from the new consultant on the plan resilience actions analysis, and then really start digging into recommendations. Also wanted to flag our next full TAC meeting is on March 13th. It is in person in Richmond, the Patrick Henry building, with options for virtual participation. And otherwise, that is all I've got. We've got some action items captured in the notes, and the minutes will be distributed via email and posted online after this meeting. Any final questions, comments?
I'm just gonna put in some final comments before the end. We have 3 meetings left with our subcommittees. 3 2-hour meetings, 6 hours that's left with this group together. We have a lot of work that's going on with the phase 2 impacts analysis, the flood hazards. Those deliverables and milestones do not align with a quarterly schedule. And so we still want your input on this work that we're doing. We're gonna be sending out a lot more emails to try to solicit input. It may not have a long lead time. We're gonna try to work on getting lead times so you know what's coming. It's probably gonna have a quick turnaround time as well, so that we can consolidate your input, then provide feedback to our contractors so they can continue to move on to meet this schedule. With that being said, with those 3 meetings we have left, we think the valuable part of the meeting is getting you all together and having some open discussions. That's where I think the recommendations can be the focus of those meetings. If you have any thoughts, though, about what else we may need to cover in these meetings, or what could help us be more productive, please let us know. We're willing to be flexible. We're going to have some additional facilitation support coming in, but we do want to try to use this time as best as possible. What didn't happen at the end of phase one is phase one came out and we stopped, right? We did not meet again. As it's currently set up in code, the TAC continues, pending what legislation that's out there where it may change, but there is still opportunity for implementation. I think this was some of your comments, Mayor Carson. We're going to be putting out a lot of information and releasing a plan at the end of this year. Then what? And that's kind of a lot of where I think we could benefit from your recommendations as far as next steps. How do we keep this momentum moving and not just stop and say, we'll see you all in 3 years when we do this again? So we have limited time. Some of the other subcommittees have requested maybe a longer workshop, and that's something we're evaluating, maybe for the next meeting or the meeting after that. But prior to these meetings, we'll probably be requesting information so we can be as best prepared and try to skip some of the intro stuff and try to really dig into the information. So I know this is all additional work, additional duties as designed. Most of you all are voluntold to be here and provide input. We do value it. We're trying to show that and that it's making a difference in our work. And we're just trying to see if there's anything we can do better to make it easier to participate and engage. Please let us know so we can work on that and keep moving this forward. But I do want to thank everybody for their time and their input. It is very helpful in this process.
Anything else? Okay, hearing none, we'll adjourn for today. Thank you, guys.
Thank you all.
Thank you.